Thank you. So I think in the area of public education, your first point, I think that's a great idea. We're definitely in favor of having evidence-based education in young age about this is what drugs are. These are the various social scenarios where you might find yourself in drugs. These are the harms of drugs. These are why people take drugs. And report feelings of benefit or otherwise in medical use or otherwise. So I think having a discussion from a very early age based on evidence rather than myth and scare tactics is good. I grew up under just say no in the frying pan with the egg, and here I am testifying to the House Committee on legalizing drugs. So I don't think that those messages work in the way that they're intended to. And so I think basing it on evidence, and also having, where possible, having young people themselves as the educators and talking about their own experience would make it more effective. On your second point around the ticketable offense, I think again, as Dr. Culbert said, the ticketing is preferable to criminalization. I think in the best scenario, we would create a social framework where it's not necessarily a punitive approach against young people, but more working with them about use. And I don't think having the floor of no tolerance, zero possession is realistic. I think that would incentivize police to sort of go after just minor things, hassling young people. I think, if someone's smoking in public, it could be confiscated, and the peace officer could say, don't do this. It's, but I think ultimately, I don't think there should be any process at zero tolerance to be effective.
Thanks. Mr. Davies.
Dr. Grant, I want to kind of probe a little bit the state of the research on this to sort of separate what we believe and what we know. We've already heard from a number of witnesses the challenges of conducting research in a criminalized environment where there's all sorts of difficulties with doing research. I mean, it's hard to have control studies, where you have a group of 15-year-olds smoking cannabis and a group that are not, and then charting their path. You have ethical considerations, of course, and of course the fundamental issue of causation versus correlation. A recent study from Harvard Medical School and the VA Boston healthcare system found that, quote, while cannabis may have an effect on the age of onset of schizophrenia, it is unlikely to be the cause of illness. And that in general, we found a tendency for depression and bipolar disorder to be increased in the relatives of cannabis users in both the patient and control samples. This might suggest that cannabis users are more prone to affective disorders than their non-using samples, or vice versa, end quote. So although intuitively I share the concern that cannabis use in young people is not a good thing and can't be positive, I absolutely believe that. I'm just wondering, I think it's important as a health committee that we find out what we believe from what we know. So is there a causative element established in the literature with respect to cannabis causing mental illness, or is it correlated?
So thank you for the question. As I mentioned in my brief, first of all, the CPS statement is based on the scientific literature, not on belief, but rather on the facts that we have at the time we're reviewing the data. The relationship between psychosis and cannabis is complicated. We can't say, or my understanding of the state of the literature is that we can't say with 100% certainty that it's causative, in the sense that only cannabis use in a young person, regular over time years, would for sure result in them developing a psychotic illness. However, based on many studies, we know that there are a number of different types of psychotic outcomes. We know from rigorous research that one of the side effects of using cannabis can be an acute psychotic episode. Some youth experience that when they're high. There is another type of acute psychotic episode that can last days to weeks. And often those youth end up coming to emergency rooms being seen because the psychotic symptoms have lasted beyond the high or the use. We know from research those youth, if they're followed, have an increased likelihood of about 50% of having another psychotic episode in the future not related to cannabis. I'm not a schizophrenia expert, but reviewing the literature, there's definitely a link between regular, ongoing cannabis use that starts young, that continues, and the development of it. But, like I mentioned in my brief, it's not that alone. So from the literature, for example, the sort of risk of having a psychotic illness in an adult is about 1%. So add regular ongoing cannabis, that doubles the risk to 2%, which sounds quite low if we think 2% versus 1%. However, if you have a family member who has suffered from schizophrenia or a psychotic illness, and your risk as an individual is much higher, then doubling the risk with cannabis becomes significant.
So on the question of, are people who are prone to schizophrenia more likely to seek out self-medications, as Dr. Ailfson said, or do people who use cannabis tend to that lead to more psychotic episodes? That's kind of the essence of my question. How do we know that? So, how do we know that the person wouldn't have had psychotic episodes in any event?
Right, and it's a great question. Schizophrenia isn't my main area of expertise, but there are a number of studies. I'm happy to give you those references. They're referenced in the Canadian Pediatric Society statement, indicating that it's not
there may be
it's not that the psychosis came first and then it's self-medicating, but rather it's the reverse.
Okay,
but it's complicated.
Okay, I want to just push a little bit on pursue the issue of edibles. I'm not sure I have your testimony correct, so I want to clear this up. Are you suggesting that this legislation should not legalize edibles?
I'm aware, my understanding is that in the current legislation, we're talking about pot and growing of plants. Not edibles is not mentioned.
Correct.
Okay? My concern is that we need to make sure that this issue around young children having accidental ingestions with edibles is up there, that people know about this risk, so that it's not lost.
Yeah, well, Colorado has done that, and we've heard evidence about this. They're absolutely correct about that, making sure that there's single servings, they're in child-proof containers, that there's no marketing to children, the product itself is stamped so that you can tell what it's going to be. All of these sort of conditions have been implemented in Colorado. Would it be your testimony that if we do that, then edibles should be legalized? And the reason I ask, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to get my context out here. It's because of your testimony on aligning the age with alcohol and tobacco, that you felt it was preferable to get access to regulated products of known quantity and avoid high-risk behavior, which if you don't legalize edibles, you are leaving edibles to the complete black market where it's totally unregulated, and high-risk behavior in young people who will continue to have access with no regulation whatsoever will continue. So that was sort of I wanted you to square that circle for me. I guess I'm putting to you that we should regulate edibles, because if we don't, the exact same problems will occur that you described occurring by not legalizing cannabis at a proper age.
I'm not saying that edibles should be legalized. I'm saying that there's lots of concerns of young people and toddlers ingesting edibles if they're around in the household. And even though those measures might prevent harm that you mentioned, child-proof, having them around, that it's a concern. The edibles are a concern, and that's not been discussed.